A gunshot cracked through the icy morning silence of Auschwitz. Children flinched. Wine, wine, wine. Guards did not. The snow turned darker where the body fell, another nameless soul erased before breakfast. In the nearby barrack, 6-year-old Elias held his twin sister Liesel's hand tighter. The whistle blew. A shadow entered. Dr. Josef Mengele, smiling like a wolf among rabbits. Mengele said, "Ah, my precious twins, come now, let us see what makes you identical." Elias wanted to scream, but his throat was dry with fear. Liesel stared blankly, the way only a child too broken to cry could. They were marched past corpses stacked like wood, past surgical rooms reeking of ether and rot. Their names would not be remembered, but what would be done to them would stain history. This was not a hospital. This was a laboratory of pain. This was not medicine. This was war against the body itself. Act 1 opens not with science, but with silence, broken only by a child's breath before the needle. They were called Mengele's twins. To the guards, they were merely numbers. To Mengele, they were instruments. But to each other, Elias and Liesel were all that remained of home. Born in Warsaw, they were taken during the final purge, ripped from their mother's arms on a rainy April morning. Each day began with needles. Blood drawn, measured, mixed. Injections of unknown fluids that made Liesel collapse. Scans with crude equipment. Then questions. "How are you feeling?" Mengele would ask, as if pretending to care. Elias never answered. He just looked at Liesel and counted her breaths. 10, 9, 8. One night, he whispered to her, "If I die, you must remember our names." But memory was a dangerous thing here, and survival required forgetting who you were before. The tests escalated. Liesel was injected with dye in her eyes. They burned for hours. Elias was forced to watch. Then came the amputations, not always surgical. Sometimes Mengele simply wanted to see how long one twin could survive, what the other did not. Guards joked about angelic studies. That was Mengele's nickname, the Angel of Death. Liesel once asked softly, "Why do they smile when we cry?" Elias had no answer, only hatred and fear. The guards told them they were lucky, special, chosen. But special was just a word that meant, "You'll die slower." The twins were photographed endlessly, their faces documented, their scars measured, but never their screams, never their tears. History keeps records, but it often erases the horror between the lines. Outside the lab, the war raged on. The Soviets were advancing. Rumors whispered through the barracks, liberation. But inside Block 10, liberation meant nothing. Mengele doubled his efforts. If the Russians came, there would be no evidence. Records were burned, bodies buried shallow. Twins were disposed of if results failed to meet expectations. Elias clung to Liesel's hand during one final test. Her breath was faint. Her pulse fluttered. Mengele didn't even look at them. He was scribbling notes, calculating data, chasing a purity that only existed in fantasy. A single tear slipped down Elias's cheek. Mengele said coldly, "We are not monsters, we are scientists." But the floor beneath them was soaked in childhood. The air reeked of absence. Science here was murder with a clipboard. That night, Liesel stopped breathing. No screams. No struggle. Just silence. Elias didn't cry. He simply turned his face to the wall where their names had been scratched into the wood. The guards would take her in the morning. She would be recorded as specimen failed. But to Elias she was the last word spoken in their mother's voice. He whispered her name until dawn. In that moment, something broke. Not his hope, but his need to be seen. He would survive. Not for revenge, not for escape, but to exist as proof that they lived, that she mattered. The world would forget Liesel, but he would not. Her name would be carried in every breath, every step, and someday someone would speak it aloud again. After Liesel's body was taken, Elias was no longer called by his name. The clipboard read only, Twin B42. He stopped speaking, stopped responding, even when needles pierced his spine, even when electrodes shocked his skin. He became a shadow, watching everything, recording silently. In the silence he heard the others. Dozens of twins. Some identical, some fraternal, all broken in different ways. A girl named Hannah had burn marks running up her back. Her brother was gone. No one asked where. Hannah whispered to Elias, "We're just pages in a notebook to them." He nodded slowly. But something hardened in him. Even the smallest page can carry the truth. And even a silent child can remember. If he survived, it wouldn't be as a victim. It would be as a witness. And witnesses never forget. Among the many imprisoned children, one stood apart. Miriam Weiss, age 9, had fiery eyes and a sharp tongue. Her twin David was her opposite, silent, pale, always trembling. They had survived countless experiments. Now, David could no longer walk. Miriam would carry him on her back during roll call. Every morning, every night, through snow, through beatings. A guard once spat, "Leave him. He'll slow you down." She snarled back, "Then shoot me too." That night, Elias watched her from his corner of the barrack. She was rubbing David's feet, whispering a song in Hebrew. Her voice cracked, but she never stopped. That was the first time Elias wept since Liesel. Not from grief, but from something he barely recognized anymore. Hope. In a small unused storage room behind Block 10, the children discovered something forbidden, a crack in the wooden wall. It was no path to escape, but through it they could see the sun rise. A sliver of gold through steel and smoke, a reminder that the world outside still existed. Each morning one child would be chosen to peek through the crack. Just 10 seconds. That was the rule. Elias's turn came after a week. When he looked through, he saw a tree. Just one, past the fence. Bare and frozen. But real. Alive. But wine. He whispered, "There are no fences around the sky." And the others nodded. The crack was not salvation. But it was something more dangerous to the Nazis than any weapon. It was imagination. One night, the barrack erupted in muffled chaos. Guards were running. Dogs barking. A twin, Ilse and her brother Marek, had escaped the medical wing. Rumors flew fast. They'd stabbed a nurse. Tried to flee through the crematorium. By morning, silence returned. The twins were dragged back. Bloodied. Shoeless. Broken. Mengele gathered the children in the yard. He made them watch. Ilse's eye was swollen shut. Marek couldn't stand. Mengele said calmly, "Curiosity must be punished." Then, before them all, he injected Ilse with formalin. Slowly. As she screamed. Elias turned away. Miriam did not. She stared until it was over. She whispered, "They want us to be afraid of death, but I'm only afraid of forgetting." Elias clenched his fists, because remembering had just become an act of rebellion. That winter, the hunger became unbearable. The children gnawed on boot leather, chewed paper, anything to silence the pain. When David collapsed one night, Miriam screamed. Elias knelt beside them. David's lips were blue, his breath shallow. "There's nothing left," Miriam said, her voice raw. "Not even tears." Elias removed the string from his coat, unraveling it. "Braid this into his fingers," he whispered, "so he doesn't feel alone." That night, Miriam sat rocking her brother's thin body as snow crept through the broken window. Elias etched their names into the barrack wall beside Liesel's. 3 names. Then a 4th. Because the only way to survive was to carry the dead with you. 1 name at a time. Winter deepened. Frost crept through every crack, but the children's eyes burned hotter than ever. Hunger, death, grief. They had grown used to it. What they hadn't grown used to was the sound of silence after a scream. That sound meant someone was gone. Miriam began documenting everything, on scraps of linen, on stolen paper, in whispered memory chains passed from child to child. Elias listened, and memorized, catalogued every injection, every loss. He created a map of the camp from memory. A plan for escape? No. A record. Because history would try to forget them. One night, he whispered to the others, "They can take our names off the clipboard, but they can't erase what we tell each other." For the first time, children huddled not for warmth, but for remembrance. And remembering in this place was the first taste of rebellion. The experiments intensified. Elias was selected for a new test, bone marrow extraction, without anesthesia. They restrained him to a cold iron slab. He didn't scream. Mengele frowned. Later, the assistant muttered, "He didn't cry, he's not useful anymore." That night, Miriam said, "They fear silence now." Elias couldn't walk for 2 days. Miriam and 2 others fed him, helped him to the latrine, carried him like a brother. Pain became background noise. It was dignity they refused to surrender. One child drew pictures in charcoal on the walls, of wings, of trees, of stars. Elias stared at one sketch for hours. A bird mid-flight. Daitu. No fences. He whispered, "Even in cages, we remember the sky." And those small acts, the feeding, the drawings, the silence, became louder than screams. One dawn, a shipment of new children arrived. Twins. Taddy. Fresh. Confused. Crying. The veterans, Elias, Miriam, others, watched in silence. They remembered being those faces once. Later that night, Elias approached 2 boys, 5, maybe 6, huddled near the door. One had already been injected. The other hadn't stopped crying since. Elias knelt and whispered, "The worst part is not knowing what they'll do. But we'll help you. You're not alone." The boys blinked. One reached out and held Elias's sleeve. In that small gesture, something changed. They were no longer just survivors. They were protectors now. And protectors fight, even when they're starving, even when they're children, even when the war is lost outside. Inside these walls, they had declared a different war, to keep each other human. A storm rolled in that night. Wind shrieked through the rafters. The guards stayed inside. The camp fell strangely quiet. It was then that the children moved. From bunk to bunk, they passed the names, the dates, the memories, whispered them in chains, one voice at a time. It took all night. Miriam called it the memory circle. Each name spoken aloud was like breathing life into ghosts. David, Liesel, Paul Deschal, Ilsta, Marek. B. Their names rang like church bells in whispers. When sunrise broke, they sat in silence, watching light crawl across the frostbitten floor. The cold still hurt. Hunger still gnawed. But something had shifted. They had given their dead a second life. And that life could never be erased. Not by war, not by Mengele, not by time. Then came the whisper, "The Russians are near." It spread like fire through the camp. The guards grew nervous. Documents vanished. Medical tools were buried. Mengele paced more than usual. Then came the order. Destroy the evidence. Children were taken in pairs, never seen again. Experiments ended. Screams grew fewer. But the silence was worse. Elias and Miriam hid the memory scraps, under floorboards, inside mattress seams, behind loose bricks. Every name, every drawing, every secret. "We may not leave here," Miriam said, "but our truth will." Elias added one more line to the wall, beneath all the names. "We were here. It wasn't escape. It wasn't justice. But it was immortality, etched in wood, carried in whispers. A quiet defiance. A final declaration." January 27, 1945. The gates opened. But there were no cheers. The Red Army soldiers entered with caution, rifles ready. The snow was knee-deep. The smoke still rose. What they found wasn't victory. It was silence. Starvation. Death. Children staring like ghosts. Elias sat by the wall where names were carved. He did not move. The soldiers were shocked. Photographs were taken. Medical care was summoned. But something darker lay beneath the frost. "Where are the doctors?" one soldier asked. Gone. Mengele had vanished days earlier, his notes burned, files missing. The children were survivors. But their tormentor had walked out through the same gates they entered. Elias looked into the eyes of the soldier and said, "He left before the light came." And just like that, the monster disappeared into history's shadow. The Soviets documented everything. Photographs, testimonies, medical evidence. But when asked about Mengele, the adults shrugged. The children answered, "He wore white. He smiled. He heard us." But no name was written. No official file recovered. His crimes were whispered, not archived. And then came the orders. Move them to Krakow. Quarantine. Classify. Silence. Elias and Miriam were separated. The circle scattered. The wall was torn down during cleanup. Elias fought to hold on to every name. He whispered them each night like a prayer. But in the world beyond the wire, something colder than winter awaited them. Bureaucracy. History. Denial. Wall. And behind every headline of liberation stood 100 buried stories, ever told, never believed. The gas had stopped. But the silence had just begun. 2 years passed. Then 5. Then 20. Mengele was spotted in South America. Argentina. Away. Then Paraguay. Then gone again. Governments shrugged. Files were lost. Witnesses ignored. Elias, now grown, testified in Nuremberg, but Mengele was not on trial. No twin experiment charges filed. No arrest. He realized something deeper than Mengele had survived. Complicity. Elias met other survivors. Some remembered every detail. Others blocked it out. Some never spoke again. But all shared one wound. They had been erased. "I thought the world would want to know," Elias told a reporter once. "But I learned, truth is only useful when it's convenient." And for some, this truth was too monstrous to fit inside any courtroom. In 1979, Mengele drowned off the coast of Brazil. Stroke while swimming. Buried under a false name. Years later, DNA confirmed it was him. But by then, it was too late. No trial. No justice. Only bones. Elias received the news in a small letter, typed, unsigned. He read it once. Then burned it. Miriam called him that evening. She was tired. Her lungs scarred. "Cancer," they said, from the injections. She'd outlived the angel of death, but not his shadow. "They'll say he died a free man," she whispered. "No," Elias replied. "He died a fugitive, and I'm still here." It wasn't justice, but it was something. And for those who had no grave, no name, no voice, Elias would speak. Elias stood one final time outside the ruins of Auschwitz. Older, weathered, but unbroken. Tourists passed by. Some took selfies. Some cried. Others looked away. He placed a single photo beneath the frost-bitten barbed wire. Liesel, age 6. Eyes wide. Smile missing. A guide nearby spoke facts, dates, numbers, statistics. But Elias knew better. He knew that between every number was a face. A child. A breath. A scream. He turned to the wind and whispered, Liesel. Not for history. Not for headlines. But so the ground would hear her name again. And maybe, somewhere beyond memory, she would whisper back. Elias began to speak. At first, just to a school. Then, a museum. Then, across continents. He stood in front of podiums shaking hands with politicians, answering questions that made him bleed all over again. Why didn't you escape? Were the experiments really that bad? He never yelled, never wept in front of cameras. But in every answer, he laid bare the truth. I was 6. My sister was murdered beside me. The men wore white coats. They took our names and gave us numbers. We were children, not cases. Some gasped. Some looked away. But Elias never flinched. Every word was for the ones who could no longer speak. Every breath he took reminded the world. The war may have ended, but the silence did not. And silence, left unchallenged, grows back like a weed. At one speech, a girl raised her hand. Maybe 10 years old. She asked, "Did you love your sister?" Elias froze. It was the only question that made him falter. Not because he didn't know the answer, but because no one had asked it before. He knelt. "Yes," he whispered. "More than anything, she saved me even after she was gone." The girl handed him a drawing. 2 stick figures, holding hands, under a tree. "I made this for her," she said. And for the first time in 50 years, Elias cried in public. Not from grief, but from the aching, unbearable mercy of being remembered. The applause that followed wasn't loud. It was reverent. Because in that moment, the world had seen her. Liesel. Alive, in a child's drawing. Miriam's health declined. Her lungs failed. The injections had left scars no scalpel could reach. Elias visited her bedside one last time. They held hands in silence. "I don't want to be buried in white," she said, voice faint. "I want color, blue maybe, something warm." He promised. She closed her eyes. "We were just children." "You still are," Elias whispered. When she passed, he buried her with blue ribbons and the drawing the girl had given him. Not in a museum. Not in a state grave. But beneath a tree near a small lake, far from fences. Far from labs. He carved 2 words into the stone. Miriam Weiss, witness. And when he stepped back, wind stirred the leaves gently. The world might not remember her story, but the earth would. Elias stopped giving speeches after Miriam's death. He said what he needed to say. The rest was for history to carry. He spent his final years in a modest apartment surrounded by books, letters from survivors and photos, some real, some drawn from memory. One night he opened a faded box. Inside, Liesel's last hair ribbon. A stitched cloth Miriam had hidden. The tiny stone from the crack in the wall where they once watched the sunrise. He placed them all on a windowsill. And as he sat, he whispered the names again. All of them. The wind didn't answer. But the silence was softer now. Not cruel. Not empty. Just full of memory. The kind that doesn't fade. Doesn't die. Only waits until someone listens. When Elias passed, there was no parade. No television headlines. Just a small group. A plaque. A name among many. But in a school in Krakow, one teacher told her class a story. Of twins who survived something unspeakable. Of a boy who never stopped remembering. Of a girl whose name once vanished into ash, but returned in breath and ink and whispers. Children listened. Then, one by one, wrote their own names beside Liesel's on the classroom wall. Not to claim her pain, but to share her space. And so, she lived again. Not in pity, not in shadow, but in the light of names that would not be erased. That is where this story ends. Not in silence, but in a chorus of names the world was never meant to hear again, now spoken. Decades later, medical institutions around the world quietly debated a haunting question. Should Mengele's data be used? The experiments were barbaric, but the records were meticulous. Could the pain of murdered children serve modern science? Some argued yes. It would honor their suffering, they said. Others recoiled. Elias, when asked, gave only one answer. No truth born of torture is worth preserving. He believed knowledge must come with ethics. Without it, science becomes cruelty wrapped in white linen. And still, behind closed doors, some used it. Quietly, without attribution. The children were turned into footnotes. Not victims. Not names. Just unethical data in a citation. Elias once said, "They didn't just kill our bodies. They tried to own our legacy." And legacy misused is its own kind of violence. In Israel, survivors gathered for the first time. Some had never spoken. Others wore their numbers openly. When Elias entered the room, now elderly, the silence broke. Miriam's name was the first word spoken. Then came others, Ilse, Marek. David, Liesel, lies. Not ghosts. Not numbers. People. They wept, but not for the pain. For the remembering. One survivor said, "We were not supposed to exist." And yet here they were, scarred, yes, but present. Breathing. Numb. The Nazi dream had been eradication. But every hug, every tear, every tremble was a defiance older than revenge. It was presence. The ultimate rebellion was not hatred. It was survival. Somewhere in Germany, a quiet room was converted into a museum. Inside, a display case holds a striped uniform, no longer than a pillowcase. Next to it, a photo of twins, smiling before the war. And beside that, a wall of names, etched into steel. Visitors pass by in silence. But not all stop. Some glance. Some murmur discomfort. Some walk faster. Elias once visited it before his death. He stood before the uniform for nearly an hour. Not because it was his, but because it could have been Liesel's. He whispered, "I remember the sound it made when she walked." That night, a visitor left a ribbon on the floor. No note. No explanation. Just remembrance. Unspoken but unmistakable. In the 2000s, a researcher found a journal hidden in Krakow's archives. Inside, lists of names, sketched faces, coded drawings of medical equipment. At the bottom of each page, the same symbol. A tiny bird. It was Elias's. The journal had survived the decades, buried between bureaucratic files, misplaced in chaos. It became the cornerstone of a new memorial exhibit. A handwritten record. A child's voice defying time. When asked how it had endured, the curator said, "Someone risked everything to hide it." That someone, though never named, gave future generations a bridge. A fragile, precious thread woven from terror and truth. And sometimes, truth survives not through official history, but through the hands of children who refuse to forget. Every year on Holocaust Remembrance Day, a bell rings at Auschwitz. Not loud, not grand, just a single chime echoing across the frozen ground. And beneath the snow, beneath the soil, the names remain. Carved into walls, pressed into books, held in drawings. Liesel, Miriam, Elias. They were not heroes, not warriors. They were children. Innocent. Ordinary. And in that ordinariness lies the horror and the holiness of remembering them. Because genocide is not just murder, it is erasure. And every act of remembrance is a rescue. One name, one breath, one voice at a time. So let the bell ring, not in mourning, but in resistance. In a quiet attic in Warsaw, a woman sorts through a box of forgotten things. Her grandfather has passed, and now the past must be unpacked. She finds photographs, letters, a name she doesn't know, Elias. She brings the photo to a museum. The curator gasps. We know that face. It matches a sketch drawn by Elias over 70 years ago. The woman stares. I thought she was just a story he told us at bedtime. The curator replies, she was real, she saved him. And suddenly bedtime stories become historical record. Memory becomes truth. Not every legacy is built with monuments. Some live inside cardboard boxes, waiting. In Berlin, a group of high school students visit a Holocaust center. They pause at a digital wall of names. One boy stops. Who was Liesel? He asks. The guide says, she was 6, her brother survived. Another student whispers, so did her story. They light a candle, not because they were told to, but because it felt necessary. The flame flickers. It has no voice, no shape, no command, but it fills the room with warmth. That, the guide says, is what memory is supposed to feel like. Not cold, not clinical, but lived, witnessed, loved. Somewhere, in a university lecture hall, a professor teaches medical ethics. He shows a slide of Josef Mengele. Then a second slide, Elias's words etched on screen. No, truth born of torture is worth preserving. A hush fills the room. He says, this is why ethics matters, because genius without conscience is simply cruelty in disguise. One student writes the quote down. Years later, she becomes a doctor. She keeps the quote above her desk. Not for show, but as a boundary, because the sins of medicine are not only in what is done, but in what is justified. Liesel's name appears on a memorial website. One visitor leaves a comment. I never knew you, but now I can't forget you. Another writes, I named my daughter after you. There is no statue, no grave, but the thread stretches across oceans, languages, time. Because history is not made of facts alone. It's built of names spoken aloud by those who never met them. And in that digital silence, 1,000 whispers rise. Not shouting, not weeping, just remembering. That, in the end, is how the lost return. Not as ghosts, but as echoes inside those willing to carry them forward. The wind moves through Auschwitz again. Cold, hollow, nigh. The stones remember. The fences rusted, still hold shape. But it is not just a place of death anymore. It is a place of voices. Elias, Miriam, Dottie, Liesel, Lenin, Date, Abdal, D. Voices that should have been buried, but weren't, because the truth survived in drawings, in whispers, in quiet acts of resistance, in names carved into wood. And now, in you, you have heard them. You cannot unhear them. And that is where the story ends, with a whisper from the past, one that history tried to erase, but now lives in your chest. Liesel.